The first ideas of vertical flight are thought to have been invented by the Chinese in 400 AD. Originally the principle was used in kites and would be continued throughout the world with other toys using feathers for the blades of some vertical lift toys. In the Middle Ages that were started by pulling a string. In the 15th century Leonardo da Vinci had made sketches for a full-size vertical lift machine, as humans throughout history have thought of how to fly like birds, and vertical flight. His version he called the helical air screw, and was designed for the Duke of Milan. This had a similar idea as a helicopter, but instead of 3 blades it had one screw-shaped tarp over the platform. Only models are to have believed to have been built, and a full-size version was never constructed. More plans had been developed but never implemented by Sir George Cayley in 1843 of a vertical lift craft which had 4 rotors. This project never was able to be tested as he could not find a motor that was powerful enough. The first successful invention on the way to making a helicopter was the gyroplane. The first flight of a gyroplane was on January 9, 1923. This was an attempt to improve the current planes by allowing them to fly safely at low speeds. The engineer was a Spanish man named Juan de la Cueva. How he planned to achieve a safe but slow flight was having rotors carrying the plane. The propulsion was like a normal plane with a front propeller pulling the plane forward. The top rotor was not powered and spun from the air moving through the rotors. The difference between a helicopter and a gyrocopter is that a helicopter is lifted by its rotors, and the rotors are forced through the air to create lift. Another important achievement in the development of a helicopter was the Brigade Durand Gyroplane Laboratoire. This originally started development in 1929 by the French plane engineer, Louis Breguet, and his company he founded, the Syndicate for Gyroplane Studies. The Donrad name comes from a major person in its development, being the technical director René Donrad. The gyroplane was finished in 1933. While it was called a gyroplane, it was not a gyroplane in design, as the coaxial rotors were powered rather than having the wind go through them. And a gyroplane would have the craft being propelled by a separate front propeller, which this did not have. It also did not have wings, it only had some support structure on both sides of the cockpit for balance. The first true flight took place on June 16, 1935, flown by its pilot Maurice Claes. Eventually the gyroplane through many flights set multiple records for vertical lift craft, such as speed by going 75 miles per hour, height by gaining 518 of altitude, and a record for endurance by flying for 1 hour and 2 minutes. This was not the first time a project by Breguet had been successful, as he had designed, and his company had constructed many planes. One of his earlier planes being the first seaplane. In the 1910s his main focus was building small unarmed aircraft, many of which were used for surveillance by the French army in World War I. He also started another company that would later become the modern-day airline of Air France. The next advancement that led up to the first true helicopter was the Focke-Wulf FW-61. While it was further away from the concept of a helicopter, it was an improvement in advancement when compared to the Breguet gyroplane. It had dual rotors mounted on a FW-44 Golden Finch frame. In this case the aircraft had 2 main rotors that replaced where on the normal FW-44 body was its bi-wing. This craft had the rotors in place of the bi-wing, and was significantly different from the design of a typical helicopter, and the Breguet design. It started the process of being designed by Professor Henrik Focke, as he believed that the constraints of a gyroplane could be expanded if they had powered rotors. This is much like the idea of the baked gyroplane. Focke and another engineer, Gerd Achilles, started the plans for the FW-61 in 1932. The first flight was 4 years later in 1936. The duration record was set again, as with test pilot Edwald Rolfs flying it, he set the record at 1 hour and 20 minutes of flight. Testing and improvements continued for years, with its second major flight record being that it achieved a height of 11,243 feet on January 29, 1939. The aircraft most commonly said to be the first practical helicopter was the Vought Sikorsky VS-300. The main man who was responsible for its development was Igor Sikorsky, who designed and piloted For many years he was able to design planes. For example, his S.5 model was his first design of his own that was not heavily based on other planes. With this it was able to achieve flight, and he earned his pilot's license from the Imperial Aero Club of. He continued to design planes, and his S.6 model, which was a three-seater, won at the Moscow Aircraft Exhibition. This meant his plane was chosen to be made for the Russian Army for World War I. He would make 43 variations and models of plane before he would return to the helicopter project. He would begin working on a third design for a helicopter in 1938, when he was able to convince the United Aircraft Company that he and his division were capable of building the craft, and making a breakthrough when it came to perfecting the vertical lift craft. The VS-300 was different compared to other helicopter-like designs, as it was the first one to use a single engine to power both the main and rear rotor systems. This allowed for the craft to have less weight to move, and for a better balance. He was able to achieve better control than other crafts by adding two small vertical axis blades to the end of the tail boom for better control. The first vertical takeoff took place on September 14, 1939. This would not be the final version, as it was still tethered to the ground, and he upgraded the engine from a Lycoming engine that made 75 horsepower to a 90 horsepower Franklin engine. It had its first free flight on May 13, 1940. While it never did break the speed or height records, it did break the endurance record. It was previously held by the Focke-Wulf. The new record that Sikorsky was able to set was a flight of 1 hour and 32 minutes. The reason that many consider this to be the most successful of the early helicopters is that it is the prototype that allowed for it to become a true industry. After this was built, it was given to Henry Ford to put in his museum, where it still is to this day. Igor Sikorsky went on to develop the first production helicopter after this, called the R-4, which was based on this prototype. This out of the other vertical lift craft was the first model that was successful enough that it had its success carried on into more than just a prototype.
Near Detroit, Michigan, the first practical helicopter is brought to be placed in the Museum of Henry Ford, the gift of inventor Igor Sikorsky. A pioneer in the development of aviation, the automobile magnate adds the Sikorsky craft to his famous collection.
All of the gyroplanes and the first true helicopter were built in the years leading up to World War II. This can especially be seen on the Focke-Wulf FW-61, since it was made under the Nazi regime, and on the prototypes had the swastika painted on the tail. The first helicopter, the VS-300, had its first flight 13 days after the start of World War II on September the 14th. For the fate of the gyroplanes, the plans and development of the specific models were stopped for the war. While its development had been halted during the war, the German Focke-Wulf FW-61 prototypes were destroyed intentionally, as they were burned by the Allies. And the fate of the Brigade Durand gyroplane Laboratoire was similar, with the then German-controlled airstrip being bombed, the prototype also being destroyed in the process, even though it was a French invention.